It's a real honor to interview Anne. Always been one of my heroes. When I was talking to her earlier, she said she does three things. She's a historian, a journalist, and she also runs a kind of think tank in London at the London School of Economics. But I always think a historian, when someone says they're three things and they mention they're a historian, they're always really a historian first. And in this, I would strongly encourage everyone to read Anne's excellent provocative essay in Redefining Democracy in the 21st Century, series of really outstanding essays for this series. And Anne, you begin in terms of this fixing democracy by saying, as a historian always says, well, 500 years ago we were in a similar situation. So what was going on 500 years ago that's so relevant today?
So first of all, thank you for that opening question and opening introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this spectacular and very historic room. So I began the essay, as I sometimes like to begin talks, by saying, imagine that we are suddenly at a moment when everybody can read and everybody can write, and suddenly the people who used to control all the sources of information no longer have access to it, and good things are multiplying and information is traveling more quickly, but so is disinformation, and so is political scandal, and things are moving very quickly, and they're leading even very quickly to wars and conflict of a kind we couldn't imagine before. And no, I'm not talking about the present moment. I'm not talking about the invention of social media and the internet. I'm talking about the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, which was a previous moment in history when there was an information revolution that very quickly became a religious, a cultural, and a political revolution. And it's similar to the present moment in one sense, in that, of course, the invention of printing and the invention which made it possible for millions of people to read and write and have access to information was obviously good. It was obviously a positive change in the world.
Why obviously?
Well, it meant that people could have an expanded exchange of ideas. They could have access to things they didn't know. It spread information and knowledge, scientific knowledge. But at the same time, it led to the Reformation, which challenged the monks and the monasteries and the church, which used to control information. And that led to the divisions inside society. It led to what we now call polarization, which eventually led to religious wars all across Europe. And Catholics fought Protestants, and there was a Reformation and then a Counter-Reformation and backlash that went on really for many hundreds of years. And when you think about the kinds of profound changes that moment caused, you have to, that's a way of understanding just exactly how profound the current moment is. I mean, I think we all, we've become already really blasé about very revolutionary technologies. I mean, the iPhone was invented in 2007, so 12 years ago. And now almost everybody, not just in the developed world, but all over the world, in Africa and Asia and Latin America, now walks around carrying a little mini computer in their pocket, which enables them, in theory, to communicate with every other single person on the planet. And this was a kind of unthinkable revolutionary change. And of course, it's having ramifications that are political as well as sociological and cultural. And I think we've grown accustomed to it and we've become used to it so quickly that we've underestimated exactly how profound it is.
Well, before we get to contemporary democracy, as a historian, do you see the invention of the printing press and the disruption of communications as being the foundation of modern democracy?
I mean, of course, it's absolutely the case that modern democracy in the form that we know it could not exist without, well, it was created on the basis of printed information and, of course, then later broadcast information. Unless you have a society, and this is, by the way, where this is coming to the current problem, unless you have a society that shares in which you can have a common debate. In other words, that people in California and Georgia and Wisconsin can all be having the same conversation or can be discussing some of the same issues, then you can't have democracy at all. Or whether it's people in London and Edinburgh and Cardiff, you need some common basis of conversation. You need to be able to discuss common issues. And if you don't have that, in other words, if you don't have a public sphere, if you don't have some kind of mass media, then no democracy is not possible.
So,
and I think, by the way, the fact that if you look back at the founding of the United States and the important role played by pamphleteering and newspapers and so on, you can see that the newspaper and that form of printed information was absolutely key to democracy from the very beginning.
So communications is the heart of democracy. Surely then these new technologies, which, as you say, allow everyone to become a publisher, everyone to carry these supercomputers around in their pockets, everyone to perhaps disintermediate companies like Bertelsmann, doesn't that intensify democracy? Isn't that a good thing for democracy?
It can be, and in many ways it will be, and we've seen groups of people who were previously left out of the political process taking a role in them. We watched, in a number of countries, in authoritarian countries, as social media has become one of the ways in which disempowered people can connect to one another. We saw it in Tunisia, we saw it in Egypt, we saw it in many other places as well. So and this is much like the invention of printing press had two sides to it. I think there's a clear advantage for democracy in many places of having this new forms of communication. It also, though, has the potential for something else, which is creating a new kind of polarization. In other words, when we lose the media that held some, that provided a kind of common ground for discussion, we also lose the ability to talk to one another. All of us come from different societies here, but I think probably all of them are now afflicted to some degree with this new form of polarization. I mean, I lived part of the time in Poland. I have a strong connection here. I grew up here, and I live also part of the time in Great Britain. And in all three of those countries, I have seen how really profound new levels of polarization, in other words, people having completely separate conversations about politics, have made it very, very difficult to have a democratic debate. And this is not, by the way, just a question of some people have one opinion and some people have another opinion. This is the kind of polarization that you can now get online, where people live in completely separate filter bubbles or echo chambers, whatever you want to call them, and they no longer share. It's not a question of opinion. They don't share the same facts with other people.
So this
how do you have a debate with your fellow citizens if you think one set of things is true because that's what your friends on Facebook are telling you, and they think a completely different set of things is true? Many of the ways in which we're used to thinking about the press and the free press and what could be the challenges of the free press, I think, are also very outdated. I mean, what's the real challenge now to free speech? It's not just that some dictatorial government will come take you over, or as in the George Orwell novel, somebody will cut up the newspaper and shred the politically incorrect articles and put them down the memory hole. No, we have the opposite problem now, which is that an authoritarian government, or indeed a group of people online, can flood you with information. In other words, voices can be drowned out. We're all facing this problem of there being too much information, and possibly that eventually undermining any sense we have of information's value. If one of the first countries to really understand how this worked was Russia, and one of the best examples of how this worked was, if you all remember, the plane crash over eastern Ukraine, when the Malaysian airliner that was coming from the Netherlands crashed in eastern Ukraine, and as was fairly clear at the time, actually, and was subsequently proven, it was taken down by a Russian army missile. What was the Russian government's reaction to that event? It wasn't just to deny it. The Russian government's action was to put out literally dozens of explanations. So from sensible to crazy to completely insane, you know, there was a plane full of dead people that was that took off from the Netherlands and it was brought down on purpose to embarrass the Russian government. Or there was a Ukrainian plane that hit it and they were trying to shoot down Putin's plane, and there were graphics of that on television. Each one of these explanations was accompanied by all kinds of new information and graphs and drama and interviews and so on. And this effect of producing dozens and dozens and dozens of explanations had the successful effect of making people say, well, we have no idea what actually happened. And there was a very good series of interviews that were conducted in Moscow 10 days after the crash, and people were asked on the street, what do you think happened? And people said, not only do we not know, we will never know. It will never be possible to find out what happened, because there was so much information and so much of it was contradictory that we'll never know. So in other words, one of the other effects of the internet now is that you can drown people. You can drown them in trivia, you can drown them in falsehood, you can silence people in much different ways.
So you're in the kind of Peter Pomerantz camp that
he's my partner at the London School of Economics.
He sort of presents politics as a real-time reality television show, and people like Putin and I guess Trump as the masters of this circus. This is a new phenomenon. We went to Holland to interview Rob Riemann, who's in the audience. He's presenting what's happening today as a repeat of the 20s and 30s. Are you more in the Pomerantz camp than the Riemann camp? Is this a repeat of fascism, or is this something entirely new? I know you've got the Reformation idea at the back of your mind.
I mean, I don't believe that history ever repeats itself in exactly the same way. So no, I don't think this is the 1930s, and I don't think I can pinpoint exactly which moment we are, you know, whether it's the Anschluss or whether it's whether we've got to appeasement yet, and so on. I do think that each era produces new challenges, and it's very important to understand the nature of this new challenge. You know, it's very interesting, even if we just stick to this topic of disinformation, it's very interesting to hear. I was in a room of very intelligent, thoughtful people in London a couple of weeks ago discussing, and another one in Madrid actually, also a couple of days ago, discussing exactly this issue. And almost universally, everybody in the room has an instinct. We need to control the content on the internet. We need to ban things. We need to transfer our existing legal system. We need to be able to sue people for libel if they've committed libel on the internet in the way that we used to be able to sue them in real life. And I genuinely think these won't be the answers. I mean, if there's going to be a regulatory answer, it will have much more to do with the nature of, it'll be much more to do with the nature of social media. It'll be with making things more transparent, ending anonymity online, thinking very hard about algorithms. Do we want Facebook's algorithm, which emphasizes, the goal of which is to keep people on Facebook as long as possible, and which emphasizes things like anger and emotion. Things spread on Facebook more easily when they're clicked on. Do we want that to be the governing algorithm that decides what we all see? Or do we want there to be, can we imagine a public service algorithm in the way that we once dreamed up the BBC, or public service broadcasting? Is this something that there should be public involvement or public say in? If some form of Facebook is going to be how we get our news in the future. So getting people to think how we deal with the current situation and how we deal with the nature of these new information technologies, I think is extremely important. That's not to say that the analogies from the past are useful because they make us think. They remind us of what people are capable of. They remind us that, okay, when somebody starts using this eliminationist language or the language of purity and nation and so on, it reminds us of something bad. And I think that's very useful. But it may be that the solutions are going to require some understanding of what exactly is making is changing things in the present.
So your focus historically and in cultural terms is Eastern Europe. You're a scholar of Russia. You have a strong family connection with Poland. Last year there was a cover story in the Atlantic on democracy by you, and you suggested that we need to learn from what's happening in Poland and Hungary in terms of understanding the crisis of democracy. Talk briefly about the shattering of this kind of epistemological consensus in Eastern Europe and how people now can't literally talk to one another.
Yes, so that article began with a description of a New Year's Eve party that I had in 1999.
Which sounds pretty amazing, right? You made all the, what did you make, the beef stew?
There was no catering in Poland in 1999.
Surprise,
so
surprise. Right?
My mother-in-law and I made these vats of stew, and anyway. And what I tried to evoke in the article is I described the guests there, who were some friends of mine from abroad and so on, but most of them were Poles, and most of them were friends of mine and my husband. My husband was then he was a junior minister in a Polish kind of center-right government, and lots of the people who came to the party were also in politics. Some of them were journalists, and at that time we all would have felt that we were kind of more or less on the same team.
So you could talk to one another,
we
even if you didn't agree about everything.
We didn't agree about everything, but we were sort of all more or less whatever in favor of democracy and markets, because that's what we were in favor of, decommunization, and probably everybody in the room wanted to join the European Union, which of course happened a few years later. And I had a reflection more recently, which is that 20 years later, which is that about half the people in that room would no longer speak to the other half of the people in the room. That there's been such a profound polarization and such a deep parting of the ways. This is particularly on the Polish right, but I think something similar happened on the right in the United States and in Britain and in other countries too. As one group gradually moved away from those ideas, this is my interpretation of it, and began to see flaws and things missing in democracy, and began to long to be part of some kind of moral community, in some ways began to feel threatened by influences from the outside. These were the people who often couldn't speak foreign languages. Some of them could, though, and began to look for an alternative social model. But the article was also trying to describe how what is the path from democracy to non-democracy? There are many stages in between. And we tend to have an imagination, there's going to be a coup d'etat or there's going to be violence. Actually, there are a lot of ways to attack and undermine democracy that don't require any of that. And you can do it with the consent of many people. Lots of people really hate the media. They don't like it. They don't like people shouting on their television screens every night. Having it taken over by the government and having it start to sound a little calmer and everybody says more or less the same thing, a lot of people find that to be really quite a great relief. Or we who live in democracies have come to accept the idea that there's a lot of strife and argument in public life, and I thrive on that. I think it's great. I don't mind it at all. A lot of people find it bothering. Why is there so much disagreement? Why can't our politicians all agree? What is this pointless, these arguments they have in their outdated institutions?
What about the UK, the United States, Germany? How healthy is democracy in your view generally?
So the UK, I've lived there on and off for 20 years, and the real tragedy of Brexit, and I know Europeans will feel differently, but has been the disrepute into which it has brought Parliament and Westminster. And for exactly this kind of reason, people say, because most people don't understand the details of these trade agreements they're arguing about, all they can see is that their elected politicians can't come to a solution. And they find, and this is, and they know people have lied to them.
So we've got 10 minutes left. How are we going to fix democracy? How are we going to save this stuff? How are we going to reignite conversation? How are we going to do away with this sort of epistemological division so that people can begin to agree about facts again? Where do we start here? And I know you said earlier, off stage, you said to me, it's not an economic issue, it's a cultural and a political one. So perhaps you might slay the economic dragon first.
So you can slay the economic dragon by looking at Poland, actually. This is a country of great economic success, where incomes have been rising, and not just at the top, but all the way through. Inequality has been falling. Funny enough, you can also look at France, which is a country I've recently written about, where if I can get the statistic right, it's the country in Europe where there's the greatest transfer from the wealthy to the non-wealthy anywhere in Europe. In other words, this transfer of income that we think is going to make such a big difference is happening in France and has been happening in France. Nevertheless, in both Poland and France, you have major populist movements. In France, it's the Gilets jaunes. In Poland, it's actually the ruling party. And the point is that economic solutions, or imagining that this is all a problem to do with inequality, or it's only to do with some people being left behind, fails to see that quite a lot of Trump voters, quite a lot of Brexit voters were wealthy. Quite a lot of the people who flock behind populist parties are well off. They're middle class.
And the problem with democracy is, would you say, it's not just Trump voters, right? It's everybody else.
Absolutely, no, and it's partly the need to find again, and this is why I brought up public broadcasting before, find fora in which we can have conversations again.
Is the solution regulating the big tech platforms?
So this is part of it. This is part of the solution is, but as I said, not regulating in the sense of arguing about what to take off the internet and what's legal and what's illegal, but thinking much more deeply about the structure of it, how it is that information is being seen, what people are reading, and why. And the second solution might also...
But how does that work? Because it's easy to say that. I can't imagine. How would it work? Do we have fact checkers on Facebook and Twitter saying this is true?
No, this is exactly what I'm against. I mean, okay, you can have fact checkers and so on, but what you don't want to have happen is you don't want Facebook to be deciding what people read and what they don't read. What we need to think is, what is the mechanism by which the Facebook news feed works? In other words, what determines which articles you see when you open up your laptop? And that's determined by an algorithm which is set by Facebook. Maybe we need to think harder about who gets to decide what the algorithm is, who gets to decide what we read and in what order, and so on. So that's one.
And that's government, or that's citizen assemblies, or citizens? How does that work?
I don't know yet. Certainly the government should have a democratically elected government.
But it can't just be Facebook. They can't decide what everybody sees.
So right now, there are people at Facebook who make agonizing decisions about what their rules should be, and they have to make them in almost total secrecy, because if they can't discuss it with anybody outside of Facebook. And I have even had people in tech companies say to me, we wish we had a broader, if there were a broader group of people we could discuss these issues with.
What else, Anne? What else can help fix democracy apart from the regulation of the platforms?
So my dinner companion and I have just had a long conversation about what's happened to traditional political parties and why people are so disappointed by them. And I pointed out that one of the what was social democracy? It was based on a set of real-life institutions, trade unions. What was Christian democracy? It was based on another set of real-life institutions, church institutions. As those real institutions fall away, people are looking for different kinds of communities, and very often they find those communities online. You can be very involved in a political movement now and never leave your house. They're very attracted to other kinds of communities. I mean, there's a reason why the idea of the nation has come back in so many places. It's something that we can belong to. It's got a defined limit. So there's another question, which is how do we recreate communities? What are going to be the new sources of identity and security in the 21st century?
And this comes through technology, or is it a sort of a way of controlling technology?
It could be through technology. It could be something that companies do. There are people right now, there are a couple of groups in the United States. There's one called Better Angels, which is trying to create a series of almost new institutions, kind of discussion clubs that bring together
Or
people
new
from the
political
right and left.
parties, right? I mean,
New political parties, or new political parties.
I
But
mean, Rob, in his excellent piece for this book, talked about Tocqueville and local democracy as being the heart of the American dream. Do we need to go back to the local, to the city?
So look, in America, it's pretty clear that local democracy is far healthier than national democracy. And lots of people, one of the reasons why America looks so much more dysfunctional from abroad than it does when you're actually here is because many people feel that their local government, their governor or their member of Congress or the way their local town is run actually works pretty well, or at least they understand the way it works and they can participate in it if they want to. Whereas national politics seems to be very dysfunctional.
Finally, Anne, you know, these conversations are always about the other, always about populism, always about people who are reacting against democracy. But this is an audience of global elites, Germans, Americans, Europeans. We're not perfect. We're part of the problem. What can we do collectively to help fix democracy?
Think about how you participate in your community. And think about what does your company do to create a sense of place and security for the people who work for it? What does your institution do? How are you contributing to people's sense that they belong to something? Begin thinking in those terms in everyday life.
Thank you so much.